Welcome to Gripping Tales. Are you ready for today's video? It starts now.
The year is 1347. Europe is dying. The Black Death has already claimed a third of the population. Cities are burning their dead in mass graves, and desperate people are turning to God for salvation that seems impossible to find. High in the French Alps, far from the plague-ravaged valleys below, sits St. Bartholomew's Monastery, a sanctuary of peace where 12 Benedictine monks have devoted their lives to prayer, brewing, and copying sacred texts. For 2 centuries, this remote monastery has been a beacon of divine light in an increasingly dark world. But sometimes, when you dig deep enough seeking God's grace, you discover that heaven and hell are separated by nothing more than a few feet of stone and centuries of willful ignorance. What these monks uncovered beneath their sacred chapel would challenge everything the medieval church taught about the afterlife. And the evidence, if you know where to look, suggests they might have been absolutely right. This is the story of the most terrifying archaeological discovery in medieval history, and the reason the Catholic Church has spent 700 years trying to erase it from existence. Brother Matthias was the monastery's cellarer, basically the medieval equivalent of a quartermaster. His job was managing their wine production, which, let's be honest, was probably the most important function of any self-respecting medieval monastery. In late autumn of 1347, Matthias realized they needed more storage space. The monastery's wine was gaining a reputation among the nobility, and demand was increasing. So, with the abbot's blessing, he began excavating beneath the chapel's eastern wall. For 3 days, Matthias and 2 younger monks dug through centuries of accumulated debris. Medieval construction wasn't exactly precision engineering, so finding old stones and debris was expected. But on the 4th day, Matthias's shovel struck something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. Perfectly carved stone steps, descending into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow their torchlight. According to Brother Matthias's own account, which I'll explain how we have later, the steps were cut from black stone that wasn't found anywhere in the surrounding Alps. Each step was exactly the same height and depth, carved with mathematical precision that medieval craftsmen rarely achieved. But here's what really disturbed them. The air that rose from those steps was warm. In November, in the Alps, with winter approaching, warm air was rising from somewhere deep underground. And with that warm air came sounds. Sounds that no earthly creature could make. Now, any rational person would have filled those steps with concrete and pretended they never existed, but these were medieval monks, raised on stories of saints descending into hell to battle demons. Brother Matthias saw this as a divine test. 3 monks volunteered for the first expedition. Matthias himself, Brother Francis, the youngest at 19, and Brother Augustine, a former crusader who'd seen his share of horrors. They descended carrying blessed torches, holy water, and enough courage to make questionable life choices. The staircase descended for exactly 127 steps. Matthias counted each one. The walls were smooth black stone, carved with symbols that none of them recognized. But Francis, who was responsible for copying manuscripts, noticed something terrifying. Some of the symbols matched illustrations in forbidden texts about demonology. At step 100, they began hearing voices. Not words exactly, but human-like sounds of suffering echoing from somewhere far below. At step 110, their torch flames turned from orange to an unsettling blue-green color. At step 120, Brother Augustine, a man who'd killed Saracens in the Holy Land, began weeping uncontrollably. At step 127, the staircase opened into a vast cavern that defied natural explanation. The space was enormous, larger than any cathedral they'd ever seen, carved from the same black stone as the stairs. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with cages, thousands of them, each one containing something that had once been human but had been transformed into something unspeakably worse. I need to be careful here because Brother Matthias's descriptions are genuinely disturbing, but they're crucial to understanding what happened next. The creatures in the cages had human faces, but bodies that had been modified, stretched, twisted, combined with animal parts in ways that suggested systematic torture over centuries. And they were all very much alive and conscious. But here's what really broke the monks' minds. They recognized some of the faces. Not personally, but from artwork in their own manuscripts. These were the faces of historical figures who had died centuries earlier. Kings, popes, bishops, people who should have been enjoying eternal paradise, were instead trapped in this underground nightmare. Brother Augustine, with his military experience, was the first to understand the tactical layout of what they were seeing. This wasn't random torture. It was organized, systematic, and administrative. There were record-keeping areas, what appeared to be processing stations, and a hierarchy of demonic overseers managing the entire operation. This wasn't some random pocket of hell that had broken through to Earth. This was hell's corporate headquarters, and they were standing in the employee entrance. The three monks retreated quickly, but not before Francis managed to sketch several of the symbols and cage configurations. When they emerged, they sealed the entrance and swore never to speak of what they'd seen. For 2 months, the monks tried to return to normal life. They prayed harder, fasted longer, and threw themselves into their religious duties with desperate intensity. But the knowledge of what lay beneath their chapel was eating away at their faith. Brother Francis, the manuscript copyist, was the first to break. He couldn't reconcile what they'd seen with everything the Church taught about divine justice and salvation. If popes were being tortured in hell, what hope did ordinary believers have? Against his vow of silence, Francis began researching. He accessed forbidden texts, corresponded with scholars at other monasteries, and started documenting everything they'd discovered. His notes, hidden in the margins of copied psalms, reveal a systematic investigation into the nature of hell, salvation, and church doctrine. What Francis uncovered was even more disturbing than the physical discovery. Through careful analysis of church records and papal histories, he determined that several of the faces they'd recognized belonged to church officials who had been canonized as saints. People being actively worshipped by the faithful were simultaneously being tortured in hell. This meant either the church's entire understanding of salvation was wrong, or the church hierarchy knew the truth and was deliberately lying to believers about the nature of the afterlife. Francis decided the world needed to know. He began preparing a comprehensive account of their discovery, complete with theological analysis and his sketches of the symbols they'd found. His plan was to send copies to every major monastery and university in Europe. He never got the chance. On January 15, 1348, a delegation from the Vatican arrived at St. Bartholomew's Monastery. This wasn't unusual. Papal inspectors regularly visited remote monasteries. But this delegation was different. It included Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who would later become Pope Paul III, and a contingent of Inquisition officials. They arrived without warning and immediately confiscated all manuscripts, personal writings, and documentation from the monastery. Brother Francis's research vanished into Vatican archives that same day. What happened next depends on whose account you believe. The official church records state that St. Bartholomew's Monastery was abandoned due to plague concerns. All 12 monks voluntarily relocated to other monasteries, and the building was sealed for public safety. But local records tell a different story. Villagers reported hearing screams from the monastery for 3 days. On the 4th day, smoke was seen rising from the chapel. When villagers investigated weeks later, they found the monastery completely empty, except for scorch marks and evidence of a massive fire that had burned from the inside out. The 12 monks of St. Bartholomew's were never seen again. Their names were struck from all official records. The monastery itself was erased from church documentation and maps. But Cardinal Farnese's personal notes, discovered in Vatican secret archives only in 1978, tell the real story. The church didn't just silence the monks. They sealed the entrance to hell they'd discovered, and built an entirely new theological framework to prevent anyone from ever finding it again. According to Farnese's encrypted notes, what the monks found wasn't an entrance to hell. It was proof that heaven and hell existed in the same location, separated only by perspective and church doctrine. The torture wasn't punishment. It was the reality of eternal existence that the church had been covering up for centuries. This story might have remained buried forever if not for Dr. Marie Dubois, a French archaeological historian who stumbled across Brother Francis's marginalia in 2019 while researching medieval manuscript illumination. Dr. Dubois spent 3 years tracking down references to St. Bartholomew's Monastery through property records, tax documents, and local folklore. What she found was a systematic campaign to erase not just the monastery, but the entire geographical area from official recognition. Using satellite imagery and geological surveys, Dr. Dubois located the monastery's ruins in 2022. The site had been officially designated as geologically unstable by the French government in 1962, making excavation illegal. But Dr. Dubois obtained permits for archaeological survey work. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the monastery's layout exactly as described in the marginal notes she'd found. More importantly, it confirmed the existence of a large underground chamber beneath the eastern wall of the chapel, sealed with approximately 6 feet of concrete and steel reinforcement. But when Dr. Dubois applied for full excavation permits, she was visited by Vatican officials who claimed ownership of the site through ancient property rights. Her research was confiscated, her permits revoked, and she was informed that any further investigation would result in legal action. Dr. Dubois disappeared 3 months after her last official contact with Vatican representatives. Her research notes vanished. The monastery site was reclassified as Protected Environmental Zone, with permanent excavation bans. But here's where this story takes a turn that will completely change how you think about medieval history and modern religion. I've been telling you this story as if it were historical fact, but I need to come clean about something. There never was a St. Bartholomew's monastery in the French Alps. Brother Matthias, Francis, and Augustine never existed. Dr. Marie Dubois is fictional. But every detail I've described, the theological implications, the Church's response patterns, the systematic cover-ups, these are all based on real, documented cases of medieval discoveries that challenged Church doctrine. The real truth is far more disturbing than fiction. Throughout medieval Europe, there were dozens of similar discoveries. Underground chambers, ancient structures, archaeological evidence that contradicted official church teachings about the afterlife. And in every single case, the same pattern emerged: immediate church intervention, confiscation of evidence, disappearance of witnesses, and systematic erasure from historical records. The most terrifying part? This pattern didn't end in medieval times. It's still happening today. Archaeological sites that might challenge religious orthodoxy are regularly classified as protected or dangerous by governments working in cooperation with religious authorities. So while St. Bartholomew's Monastery never existed, the question it raises is absolutely real. What truths about human history, spirituality, and the nature of existence are being actively hidden from us by institutions that claim to seek truth? And more importantly, what would happen if we actually found them? Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The question is, are we brave enough to turn the handle?
Thanks for watching. Every ending hides the beginning of another tale, and ours is already on its way. Stay tuned, you'll find the next chapter right here, and soon.